You're listening to Latinx Therapy. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional and is not a substitute for psychological diagnoses or treatment. I'm your host, Adriana Alejandre, licensed marriage and family therapist. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode here with Latinx Therapy. My name is Adriana Alejandre, and today we are going to be talking about grief within our own community. I have done an episode. I don't know if any of you remember or heard this. For those that have been with me since 2018, the episode was with Vivian Nunez, who did a Break the Stigma segment on her organization, on her brand, Too Damn Young, after Vivian lost her grandmother. And today's episode, I'm going to be talking with a licensed clinical social worker. Before I introduce her, I just want to say that we are recording during COVID and experiencing grief globally. Here in LA County, one person here in LA County dies from COVID every 8 minutes. And that is absolutely terrifying. So let's go ahead and bring on our guest so that we can learn more about grief, el duelo in the Latinx community. Paulina Isabel Almarosa is a bilingual licensed clinical social worker and certified grief counseling specialist in the state of California. She was born in Morelos, Mexico, and lived most of her life undocumented, an experience that has greatly shaped and influenced her work as a mental health therapist. Paulina holds a master's degree in social welfare from UCLA and has over 10 years of experience in the mental health field, serving a wide range of populations, including children and families, residents of the community of Skid Row, incarcerated men and women, and end-of-life patients in hospice. Paulina is the founder of Latinx Grief, a practice dedicated to demystifying and amplifying grief in the Latinx community via grief education rooted in storytelling, music, and art. Welcome, Paulina.
Hi, gracias for having me. I'm so excited to be here and just to have these conversations about grief, which, the stats that you shared really highlight that these conversations need to happen and they need to continue to happen in our communities.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people in our community really embraced grief this year because they were forced to face it due to COVID-19, due to this pandemic. Prior to that, and we'll talk about some of these, I don't know if they're cultural beliefs, but these behaviors or ideologies that people should just get over it, right? I feel like our community is experiencing a little bit more patience with grief. So it's an interesting and sad as well transformation.
No, yeah. I am so glad that we're going to be talking about, yes, some of those ideas, beliefs, myths that people have about grief. I think this is a perfect opportunity to start addressing some of those so that we can all be supportive of each other because we're all experiencing grief right now, each and every single one of us.
Yeah. So Paulina, what does grief and grieving refer to?
I'm so happy you asked that. I think grief is a complicated term to define because even though it's a universal, so meaning all of us experience it, how we experience it is very, very unique. But, for the purpose of this conversation, I'm just going to give you all a definition that I think is easy to work with. Okay. So grief talks about a physical and a psychological response that follows a loss. So a loss being something that is not limited to death. We include death in it, but it can also mean loss of a relationship, loss of self, identity, all of the losses that come after you lose something, secondary losses, loss of your homeland, like we see in people who immigrate. And it is an ongoing and an evolving process. So not only are we centered around our emotional experience, but it's also how we cope and how it is that we respond to loss.
Yeah, absolutely. And grieving is not linear, which again, we're going to talk about, but it looks so differently with everyone. And with each loss that you experience, you're also going to grieve differently. So I recall the way that I grieved for my godmother looked differently than how I grieved for my uncle. May they rest in peace. And that was just from being a therapist and enjoying analyzing myself. Like that was fascinating to me after I healed and being able to see that, how it didn't look the same. And it's kind of maybe for some of you listening, it's like, well, duh, well, of course. But for many of us that didn't grow up with being used to losing people, it throws a curveball at you. You never know what to expect.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think what loss comes and it does is that it shakes up your routine, right? You're going through life, understanding that change happens, but it's not like, it's at the forefront. And then all of a sudden, loss comes and it shakes you. I read this comparison recently about it being like an earthquake, where it shakes up your earth and your land, and all of a sudden, things that were there are no longer there. And now you're pushed into a new direction because of the loss.
Yeah, and it's not a smooth transition into that new direction sometimes. So, Paulina, what happens to our minds, our bodies, and souls when we grieve?
So, grief, like I mentioned earlier, I think it looks different for everyone. So, all of us are going to express it differently. Okay. But keeping this in mind, what happens generally to people, okay, is the following. So, for our minds, because grief can cause changes in how our brain functions, some people report that there's changes in their mood, in their memory. It can manifest as difficulties concentrating, irritability, sadness, feeling like you're in a fog, disoriented, and just generalized, like sometimes not being present. People notice that maybe you're not there. And for our bodies, grief shows up for a lot of people physically. So they might not even know that what they're experiencing physically is grief. And grief is a very physical process. And for those of you, all of us who have grief, maybe we've sat with those sensations that can include headaches. All of a sudden, you feel nauseous, you're tired, your stomach hurts, you can't eat, your chest hurts, shortness of breath, right? All of these different things that manifest and that tell you that your body is going through something very intense. And obviously, with some of these symptoms that are physical, you want to make sure that you consult with your doctor, especially now with COVID, right? So, always checking in and making sure you're getting those physicals. And one of the things that I find interesting is that our brain can't tell the difference between the physical and the emotional pain. So, what does this really mean? It means that the parts of the brain that process physical and emotional pain are the same. And so, in other words, let's say you have a broken arm or a broken heart, the same parts seem to get activated, right? And I'm not a biologist or any of that, right?
Mhm.
So this is just something that we need to consider, because that means that the emotional stress that results from grief can activate our nervous system and release these chemicals that send us into a stress response. And then when that becomes chronic, we can really develop some medical conditions around that, right? And that's why it's important to have these conversations so that we know what's happening to our bodies. I'm going to take a pause to see if you have anything to add before I go into the soul and the spirit, because I know that was quite a bit of information.
No, yeah, absolutely. I'm following. And the somatic experience, I think, is something that a lot of people in our community tend to hold on to when it comes to grieving, but convert it into something medical rather than emotional. Because it's easier to say, like I'm about to have, or I think I'm having a heart attack, than I'm grieving, because that's too vulnerable for some people in our community. I'm curious to hear more about the soul and the body.
And yeah, and one more thing that I wanted to add to that is ataques de nervios. We've all heard people say, "Dios, me está dando un ataque de nervio." And that needs to be validated too, because in grief, sometimes in our communities, that's what they're meaning, is that their body is experiencing such a response that it feels like they're losing control, un ataque, right? And so that is also part of the physical. And it goes right into the soul and the spirit, right? What is it that grief does? We've talked about how it shakes up your idea, your world, right? Shakes up your beliefs. It shakes up what you thought was normal. So I've had folks tell me, it sends them on this spiritual quest, questioning everything that they believed in, values that they've had held on for, forever, right? They all believe this, and that. And all of a sudden it's like, what is love? What does it even mean to be here? And some people might be crushed spiritually, right? And they might not be able to make sense of it, or they might look to their religion and their spirituality to make sense of what's happened. So it can really take folks down all of these different pathways where they may search for meaning, and they may come out transformed. And it's important to note that not all people are going to find positive meaning and transformation and loss. We have a narrative, right, that after you experience the loss, well, pues ahora you need to find that there has to be some positive outcome, awakening, insight. The reality is that sometimes the loss is just a loss and it's tragic. And some people might not find anything positive in it. And that needs to also be validated and that needs to be sat with and held, especially in our communities when that can turn very gaslighty, right? And we'll talk about a little bit more about that maybe later about what we can do and say to support someone who is grieving.
Yeah. And I want to touch upon briefly what are some of the cultural traditions from our family's backgrounds, and how does grieving contrast here in the United States versus in some of our family's countries of origin?
Right. And you know what? This is a really interesting question. I've actually been sitting with this one for quite some time, not just as a mental health professional, but also as a person who has experienced significant grief. And it's not a very simple answer because there are many factors at play, right? First of all, we're not a monolithic culture, meaning we're not all, we're Latinx communities for a reason, right? We don't all share the same cultural values and traditions. But even though we vary greatly, I want to highlight that there are experiences that I have observed, especially in the immigrant community, right? When we talk about people leaving their homes and being separated from their communities, then by default, their grief here might look different because they're isolated. They might feel more isolated, and those cultural traditions then might get adjusted and shifted to fit this new environment and this new world that we're now faced with. And I say immigrant like newly arrived, right? But also even people who have been here for generations. We've had to adjust and modify some of the traditions. Some of the traditions get lost. Some of us lose contact with our ancestral ways and the ways that we used to grieve people. So I think that it's interesting and fascinating for us to have these discussions about what are people needing here and how can we give people a sense of similarity from what they had in their home country and here, right? So I think it's important to note that, yeah, some traditions might look different. For example, Dia de los Muertos, right? It might look different here versus how we practice it in Mexico because our communities are not the same. And so I'm not saying this is always the case, but this is just what I've observed and what my experience has been.
Yeah, absolutely. There are differences. So let's go into how can we support someone that is grieving a loss?
There are many, many ways that we can support people who are grieving. I think the most important thing is that we bear witness and we listen and we offer our presence to allow people to really express their feelings and their pain without judgment, because there is an incredible power in giving people the space to share their pain openly and authentically, right? Which is why we have therapy. People come to us and they open up, and it feels very powerful for some folks. Offer to help in very specific ways. So sometimes we'll say, if you need something, call me, you know, I'll be here for you. But somebody who's grieving, they might not do that. So you need to take the initiative to say, hey, let me pick up your groceries and drop them off today. Let me pick up your kids, maybe if you're closely related, and let me give you a break on Saturday mornings. How does that sound? Ask them if there's specific chores that you can do for them around the home. So, a side note on doing chores here, there's this author, Devine, who wrote an incredible book, and I'll share the title in a bit. She reminds us to always ask for consent before doing anything that she calls irreversible. For example, you might think that you're helping by washing their laundry, but you might have just washed the last shirt that their loved one wore. So consent always. And then sharing your memories and stories about the person that they lost. Say the person's name. Don't run away from saying their name, from facing the loss head on. And always remember that even though maybe it's been a year, 2 years, 3 years, a griever doesn't forget about their loved one, right? We don't forget that somebody important died. So make an effort to remember special dates, shoot them a text on those days and say, hey, how's it going? How are you doing? And share those memories and say that person's name.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that some people do shy away because it's uncomfortable, but uncomfortable doesn't mean that it's negative. So invite, sit with discomfort and ask anyway. And if you don't know what to say, I think that there's a lot in simply saying that, like, I don't know what to say, but I am here for you. at
Mhm.
minimum.
Mhm.
Some people are, there's that meme that was created when the description of it is like when someone's having feelings and then this person grabs a broom and is like they're there with the broom because they're so uncomfortable, consoling someone else. And I think sometimes even silence is so powerful. We don't even need to say words, but just existing in the same space with feelings, I think can also go a long way for some people. And I definitely want to mention to not lecture, to not say, like, you don't even know them that well, or things like
Mm.
that. I think that that can be also very invalidating to people's feelings. And
Mhm.
it's most likely not the right time and place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to lecture, and you bring on a good point too, that we don't know how to respond to grief and loss sometimes because it is uncomfortable. And as a person who is there to support, we need to put our discomfort aside for a minute and be authentic and be honest. It's okay to say, I don't have any words to say. I don't know what to say right now. So I'm just going to sit here with you if that's okay. Or I'm just going to be on the phone on silent if that's okay with you. Lean into those moments where you are a human being who also doesn't know how to process all of that in that moment.
Yeah. And as a parent myself who has been grieving, one thing that I do recommend, again, as a person and also as a professional, is that it's okay for us to grieve in front of our children.
Yeah.
And it may scare them, but we can also explain what's happening because crying, because we're grieving, is absolutely a normal human response. It's a necessary response, it's the body's way of processing what's going on. Absolutely normal. So, try not to hide away from your children. Try to explain to them. And if they say, maybe you were crying in your room and you came out in your eyes, they could probably notice. If they ask you, don't say, no, I wasn't crying. Just, it's okay. This is how we start destigmatizing grief and loss and crying and vulnerability.
Yes, and children, right? That's a whole nother topic that we could explore at length. But children really are perceptive, and to have these conversations also can be healing for them. And one thing I want to add with that is it's helpful sometimes to have these conversations when you're watching a movie. So I know we have Coco, right? We have books, we have things that we can use as tools so that we are ourselves are not having to find the words, but that we can use what's already available to open up these conversations and to help children name their feelings because they also grieve and they may not have the words, but you will see it behaviorally. You will see a change in how they be in their sleep, just like we discussed all the physical symptoms. So I just want to encourage folks also to be mindful of that and to provide space for children also to share how they're feeling and what their experience is around the loss.
Yeah, try not to make feelings too much of a scary subject and a
Mm-hmm.
subject that we avoid. Let's embrace it in our families. Paulina, what are some resources that you recommend?
Oh, I said, yeah, I have so many. So I'm going to make an effort to be very concise and just offer you a 2 to 3. So one of the books that I had mentioned earlier was by Megan Devine. It's called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. It's a book that it's an easy read. It really opens up these conversations in a way that I think is done just honestly, authentically, and just very helpful. It's also available in a ton of different languages. I mean, I think she even has it in Chinese and Spanish. So that's one. The next one I think is also the Dougie Center, which is the National Center for Grieving Children and Families, and it's Dougie.org. That's DOUGY.org. And there you can find support groups, education, resources across the country, both in English and in Spanish. And then for folks that are more local to Southern California, there's our Grief House. They offer support services, education for children and adults, and that's our Grief House grief.org. You can also find all of these folks on Instagram. They're doing great work around grief, and I think that these resources I hope can be helpful to y'all.
Yeah, and I'm going to put them in the show notes for sure with all these links. And if you have experienced a traumatic grief, if you've lost a family member or relative to a crime, in every single state, there's the Victims of Crime Compensation Program, which unfortunately we do need a police report to qualify for this. There may be other ways, but I'm going to link that information to the show notes as well. But you want to do a simple Google search victims of crime and then your state. And that should bring up their website, and you can call them. Their advocates are really, really helpful, and you will qualify for, if your home was broken into, they'll change the locks, they'll reimburse you for that. If you have medical expenses, funeral expenses, they'll assist with that. And they also offer up to 40 free sessions of counseling. So it's a very helpful program that's available in every state.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Well, Paulina, where can people find you?
I am mainly on Instagram at Latinx Grief. I hang out there a lot and I share a lot of resources, a lot of information that I come across. I'm also actively right now working on creating a workshop series for Latinx women where we will really support each other through this process of grief by learning new coping skills and doing things together in community. So I want to encourage folks to come follow me and stay up to date for what's coming next.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And any new projects that you want to discuss, like your private practice?
Yeah. So, in addition to the workshop series that I am also creating, and I'm also actively working now to launch being also a private practice and getting in people for grief services and other things too. And that's going to be under Counseling Contigo. So I have two different paths for people to find me. And my private practice really does center Latinx folks. And I'm working on that so that I can see people individually also.
Yes, so that private practice for all of you listening is going to be for those in California.
Yes.
But Latinx Grief, those workshop series is going to be for anyone across the nation. Yeah. Anything else you want to?
Right. So yeah, those I'm going to more than likely they will be non-clinical, meaning that will allow me to have them and host them for people across the country and beyond. And if they ever are clinical, then yes, they are for California residents because that is where my license is active.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Paulina. Everybody stay tuned for this episode in Spanish. Thank you.